This morning, my wife and daughter Sophia aren't here. Sophia wasn't feeling well this morning, so my wife stayed home with her. But one thing about Sophia is that she loves mac and cheese. She loves mac and cheese. It's by far her most favorite food. And she loves it so much that as a family, when we're trying to decide about a restaurant to eat, her main concern is whether or not they have mac and cheese. That's all she cares about. Do they have mac and cheese? And it's really to the point that if we go on vacation where we're eating out a lot, we have to tell her, you can't have mac and cheese at this meal. You've ate them for the last 6. And we actually have to tell her that because she loves mac and cheese. But I've noticed something about my daughter, Sophia, and restaurant mac and cheese. Usually, we go to a restaurant, we get sat down, we get to bring our drinks, and then they come and they take our order. And usually about 5 minutes after they've taken our order, she starts asking, when's the food coming? When's the food coming? When's the food coming? Now, I know, when you're hungry and you're just sitting there, 5 minutes can feel like 30. I know how that works. But I've also realized something else. Usually, when we're at home and it's time to eat, we sit down at the table, the food is prepared and ready to eat at that point. That's what Sophia especially experiences. When we're at home and we sit down at the table, we eat. There's not a whole lot of lag time there. But when we're at a restaurant, we're sitting at the table and waiting while the food is being prepared. We have to, she has to actually sit during the preparation time. We're at home, she doesn't have to sit for the preparation time. She can be off doing whatever. And she's not used to waiting for the food to be cooked. She's used to really just sitting down and eating. And not being used to waiting, it makes waiting hard for her. But the thing that I think about with that is she's not the only one that struggles with waiting. In my house especially. On Wednesday this week, as I was working on the message and just thinking about things, I had an idea for a possible illustration. And I was like, okay, so I think I need to buy this thing for it. So I got online and I looked, and none of the local stores would have this, so it was going to have to be shipped. And I was looking at it, and it's like the earliest it would arrive would be Sunday afternoon. And I was just like, how in the world does it take so long to get something? And then I had to kind of chastise myself, because I remember, being a kid and getting the box of cereal, and it says collect 8 box tops and send it in, and you can get this prize. And on the box it always said, allow 6 to 8 weeks for processing and shipping. Always. And if you see the TV infomercials, be sitting there on Saturday morning eating the cereal in front of the TV, and the world's greatest Nerf gun shows up or something like that on a commercial, and you're like, man, I want that. But it says on there, you call the number, and for 4 easy payments of way too much money, allow 6 to 8 weeks for processing and shipping. It says that. That was, I remember that as a part of growing up, that sometimes it took so long to get something that by the time it actually showed up, you forgot you ordered it. It's just, that was what I was used to. But we've gotten so used to 2-day shipping or 3-day shipping that we've kind of forgotten how awesome 2-day shipping really is, how amazing it is that we can sit down at our computer and order something, and 48 hours later have it in our hands. And it could be coming from thousands of miles away, and we have it. The church, we're working on replacing our sound booth Mac. It came from Shanghai in a week. That's amazing. But because we're so used to it, we forget about how amazing it is. And that's the danger we face with every good thing in our life. We can get so used to having this good thing that we forget how good it actually is. We just begin to take it for granted. And that is especially true of things related to our faith. Now, this is the second message in our Thankful series as we approach Thanksgiving. Last week we talked about how living a life of thanksgiving allows us to remember the things we have to be thankful for, and it keeps us from being overwhelmed by the hard things in our lives. And today, we're going to be looking at the dangers that we face when we forget how good God's blessings are and how important they are in our lives and how we should be thankful for them. Now, last week we talked about the Israelites during the Exodus, and to help us understand the importance of thankfulness. And this week, we're going to be looking at the Israelites again. They're going to help us understand the dangers of forgetting how blessed we are. And we're going to start in the book of Judges. And we'll see that the Israelites are getting themselves established in the promised land. But first, I think we need to refresh our memories a little bit on the Israelites and the promised land and the promises that God gave them. If you remember, the promised land was promised to Abraham and his descendants. Starting in Genesis 17 was one of the first places that God promised that, look, this land that you're in, I'm going to give it to you and your descendants. And then Abraham had a son, Isaac, and God said to Isaac, look, this land that you're just kind of a stranger in, I'm going to give it to you and your descendants. And then Isaac had a son, Jacob. And God said it to Jacob too. And God also changed Jacob's name to Israel. But God said, look, I'm going to give you this land. You and your descendants are going to have this place. So the land was promised to the Israelites. But then, as Jacob's sons came around, there was a famine in the land. God moved them to Egypt to protect them from the famine. But then over the course of time, they became slaves in Egypt. So God then sent Moses to rescue them and lead them from Egypt to the promised land. But before they entered the promised land, God gave them this command. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So God gave them, before they even entered the promised land, God said, look, I'm giving you this land. Slowly, bit by bit, I'm going to move them out of the way. We're going to get rid of them. You're going to possess this land, but don't make any treaties with them. Don't make any arrangements with them. Don't make any deals with them. Because if you do, it will become a snare to you. It will become a trap for you. All right? And so then Moses died. God chose Joshua to lead the Israelites as they enter the promised land and begin to take the promised land. And bit by bit, just like God had promised, they took the land. They began to slowly begin to spread out, begin to take it. But then they got to a point where they quit trying. Like they hadn't taken the whole of the promised land, probably about 2/3 to 3/4 of what God had promised them. They were in control of, but they just kind of quit. And for the most part, the people just kind of said, "This is good. We'll stop here. We're happy." And then, but God had made a promise to them. God had, like, bit by bit, I will give you this land. And basically God said, look, you walk the path and I will clear it before you, but you got to keep walking the path. And they were just kind of like, this is a nice spot to stop. We'll just kind of hang out here for a little bit. And they experienced God driving out these nations before them bit by bit. They experienced God fulfilling his promise. But as they pushed deeper into the promised land, really, as God made it so that the people there could not stop them, could not stand up to them, they just kind of started taking that promise that God was with them for granted. They took that promise that God had given them and just decided that it was absolute, so they didn't really have to work for it anymore. Instead of following God as he was leading, they stopped. In a sense, they really just didn't want to keep up this necessary work because it was work. I mean, they had to keep doing it. They had to keep mobilizing their army and moving forward. And they just kind of got tired of it, I guess. And they just kind of said, look, we're good for now. God is with us now, and he'll be with us later. When we're ready to take the rest, he'll be there. That was kind of the attitude that they developed. They began to take God's protection and his provision for granted. They just assumed they would always have it, that it would always be there with them. Rather than being thankful for God, rather than taking the time to be thankful that God would even give them his protection and provision in the first place. They quit being thankful for the good that God had given him. And they had this shift in their mindset. They went from thinking, I will go to where God leads. They began to think, God will go where I am. They shifted their mindset and the focus of what they were doing. They assumed that God's protection and provision would go with them, whether they were following God's lead or not. God didn't think too highly of that attitude. And this is what he told them. Judges 1:1-3. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As the people were pushing out, as they were moving out, and then they just kind of stopped, and rather than pushing the people out like God had said, they just kind of said, we'll let you live here, but we're in control. Like we'll let you be here, but you're going to serve us. They made compromises. God didn't appreciate that. He's like, look, this is what I've given you, and you haven't obeyed me. You've given up on the promise that I've given you. The Israelites had developed this idea that God's protection and provision would go with them wherever they went. But God said, I am God. I don't follow you, you follow me. My protection and my provision go where I go. If you are not following me, you are not under my protection and provision. That is what God was telling them. And he told them that because they had stopped following him, they had opened up a trap for themselves. They had allowed a snare to entangle them. And it would be a snare that would follow them, a problem for them and all of their descendants. And it's a problem that still follows the nation of Israel today, 4,000 years later. It's still an issue for them. The Israelites stopped being thankful for God's protection and provision. They took it for granted, and then they lost it. And in the process, they made things harder for themselves. And I wish I could tell you that they had learned their lessons, that they saw what God said to them and said, okay, never again, never again. And really, like while Joshua was still alive and the elders that were there with Joshua, while they were still alive, the Israelites did really well. There wasn't a problem. But when that generation had passed, the people lost sight of why they had the good things in their life. They lost sight of why they were in the promised land, of what brought them to this promised land. A few verses after this, we read, they abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, so that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of the surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. The Israelites started out as slaves in a foreign land. God rescued them, and he took them to their own land, and he gave them their own land. He rescued them from slavery, and gave them their own land. But then they got so used to having their own land and their freedom that they forgot that it was a gift that God had given to them. And it wasn't too long after that that they really forgot God. First they forgot his gift, and then they forgot him. And when they forgot God, they lost their freedom. They lost the land that God had promised them. They lost control over it. And that's a danger that we still face today. When we take the good things that we have in our lives for granted, and when we forget to be thankful for them, we risk losing them. And Jesus told us, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Like that was a promise that Jesus gave us, and it's a twofold promise. There's two parts to it. Like one is this abundant life that comes after this life. Heaven, the spiritual promised land that we are promised as followers of God. That's one part of the abundant life. But the second fold of this abundant life is actually here in this world, this life that we have now. And I'm going to kind of pause here and tell you, this is not a prosperity gospel message. I am not telling you that God loves you so much that you can just ask him for whatever you want and he'll give it to you, because that is not what the Word of God says at all. At all. What Jesus was telling us here is that God loves us so much that no matter what's going on in our lives, we can have an abundant life of contentment and joy. And that was actually, like when this last spring or summer when we were going through Philippians, that was something that we learned from Paul in his letter to the Philippians. That was a secret that Paul explained in Philippians 4, where he said, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hungry, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Jesus in our lives allows us to find contentment and joy, no matter what's going on around us, whether things are good or whether we're struggling, whether we're facing good times or we're facing hard times. Whatever is going on, we can face it through the strength of Christ. That is the abundant life that Christ promised us, that we can have contentment and joy no matter what is going on. But when we take that presence of Christ in our lives for granted, we begin to lose sight of him. We begin to lose sight of the gifts that he's given us. We begin to lose sight of that contentment and the joy and the reasons why we can have them no matter what's going on. And when that happens, the sin of this world starts to creep into our lives. It begins to show up in places, and then it begins to pull us away from his presence and his strength. It begins to pull us away from him, and it begins to build a barrier between us and him. And then it's really only a short step back into the sin that God had saved us from. And after we give ourselves back to sin, then we have to face the worldly consequences that sin brings. And we're left dealing with the fallout of our choices. And in the midst of all that, we find that we've lost the ability to have contentment and joy in every circumstance. We've lost the abundant life that he promised to us. When we stop being thankful for the good that God has given us, we risk losing it. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. Fortunately, there's always more. In 1 Corinthians 15, God spoke to King Asa through a prophet. And God told him, for a long time, Israel was without a true God and without a teaching priest and without law. But when in their distress they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found by them. if you read through the book of Judges, you see what you see there is a cycle, a pattern that emerges where the Israelites would lose sight of God and his promises. Then they would lose sight of God. They would fall into sin. They would worship false gods. And God would remove his protection and provision from them. And these enemy nations that they had failed to drive out would then become overseers. They would take over the land, or they would plunder their land. And they would make it hard for the Israelites to live. And then the Israelites would call out to God. They would return back to God. God would restore his provision and protection to them, and things would be good for a time. But then, after a time, they would lose sight of those promises again, and they would fall right back, and it became a cycle over and over and over again. But what this verse said is just so true. When in their distress, they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found by them. When they turned back to him, they found him. And they found the good that came with him. When we lose sight of Christ, sin drives a wedge between us and him. But if we turn back to him, if we seek him, we will find him and the abundant life that he promises. We find the good things that we have to be thankful for again. I remember I had a friend in high school who was a good friend of mine, and he kind of, towards the end of high school, and especially after high school, really just kind of walked away from the church. And I remember just talking to him one time, it's like, man, it doesn't matter how far you've gone. Christ is only one step away. He's never more than a step away from us. And it's just so true with this. When we stop being thankful for the good that God has given us, we risk losing it. But when we turn back to him and we remember the things that he has given us in our lives that we have to be thankful for, he is always there for us. When we stop being thankful for Christ in our lives, when we start to take him and his presence for granted, we miss out on the abundant life that he has promised us. And it raises a question in my mind, what about you? Where are you at? Are you thankful for the good that God has given you? Are you taking it for granted? Are you just expecting that it will be there just because? Are you experiencing the abundant life that allows you to find contentment and joy no matter what? Or are you missing out on the promise that Christ gave you? We all have times in our lives when we stumble and we fall. We all have times where we mess up, and we're all struggling with sin constantly. That's a part of living in this fallen and broken world, is that sin is always there. But all it takes to get back to Christ is to repent of the sin that separates us from him and to seek him with all that we are. And sometimes, you hear these messages, we kind of get this idea if everything is not in line, then I must be wrong in some parts. And truthfully, our lives are complex and nothing is ever black and white. And there are times in our lives where we have things where we remember this thing that we're supposed to be thankful for, and we're remembering God, and we're seeking him with all that we are, but there's this little part that maybe we're not doing it in. And then we'll get that little part figured out, and we'll let Christ have it, and then there's this other part that we kind of steal back from him. And we forget to be thankful for, and we allow the world to come into that. And that's a part of living in this fallen and broken world. That's a part of the sin nature that is within us. But the truth is, no matter what is going on, Jesus is just a step away. It's really just one step back to him and one step to remembering his presence and the things we have to be thankful for because of him. All it takes is that one step. We just need to seek him with all that we are.
Hello, I'm Rich England, the pastor here at River of Life Community Fellowship, and I want to thank you for joining us for our online service today. Here at River of Life, we hope and pray that you've been blessed and encouraged by what God had to say today. If you'd like to know more about our church, we invite you to find us online at www.rolfellowship.com or on social media. We're on both Facebook and Instagram. Just search at ROL Fellowship. Thank you, and God bless.